So I'd like to again welcome Scott Weidensaul back to In Conservation With, which is sponsored by Leica Sport Optic. And my name is David Lindo, as you probably know, also known as the Urban Birder. And it's really great to have Scott back. Now, Scott, firstly, how are you and where are you?
I'm doing fine, and I'm sorry to hear you're under the weather, David. I am in New Hampshire, up in New England, where it actually finally feels like spring.
That's good.
Some of our first migrant warblers are coming back, and some of the earliest wildflowers are starting to bloom. The New England winter is finally coming to an end.
Yeah, because it's pretty tough up that way, isn't it, in terms of the weather this
It
time of
can
year?
be. It was a pretty easy winter this year. We didn't have that much snow, and it never got particularly cold, frankly.
Good. Before I actually carry on, one thing for the Zoomers out there, little competition for you. If you can guess the bird on my shoulder, then I will give you an applause. So, what is the bird? Put it in the chat. Can you guess the species on my shoulder? Now, Scott, last time you were here, you spoke about your book that you worked on, Birds of Maine, which is a fabulous book talking about the birds of that region of eastern North America and the fact that there hasn't been a book like that for years. But then you mentioned at the end of that conversation that you were working on another book which would be out in 2021, which back then seemed like 1,000 years away. But here we are in 2021, and true to your word, the book came out, and plus, I'm very honoured that you decided to actually come along and talk about it. And here is the book, A World on the Wing, all about migration in a nutshell. I mean, obviously, it's a lot more than that. Um, but I must say, and I was apologising to Scott earlier because I haven't had a chance to read all of it. But what I did read, I found A, fascinating, and B, so eloquently written. I mean, you are a fabulous writer, Scott, I must say.
Yeah. Thank you very much, David. That means a great deal coming from you.
No, it was fantastic. I was really gripped. I mean, there was right in the very beginning, you talk about going off to try and mist net grey cheek thrushes, and that was in Alaska. And I was visualizing your description of where you were, but something quite scary nearly happened.
Well, I've got a research project that I've been working on for about the last 7 or 8 years with colleagues at the National Park Service, and we're working in Denali National Park in central Alaska, where human beings are definitely not at the top of the food chain. And so we are very careful to make a lot of noise when we're out in the bush in Denali, because there's a lot of moose out there, and in the springtime, the female moose with calves are extremely dangerous. But there's also a lot of grizzly bears, and the very first year that we were working in the field, this is now probably about 6 or 7 years ago, we get up in the middle of the night. It's like we get up at 1 o'clock in the morning because the sun never really sets at that time of the year in that part of Alaska. So we're in the field by 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. We get our mist nets set up in these willow thickets, and we're crashing around, making a lot of noise, making sure that any bear that's around knows we're there and stays away from us. But then once we opened the mist nets and turned on our audio lure to try to start luring in the thrushes, we stopped making noise. We were just kind of luxuriantly lying on the tundra, relaxing for about 20 minutes or so. And I finally said, well, I'm going to go down the hill and check the nets. And my three friends were still stretched out on the tundra. And I walked down into the thicket and started, taking Wilson's warblers and blackpoll warblers out that we weren't going to be tagging and looking for gray cheek thrushes. And unbeknownst to me up the hill, my friend Laura turned to say something to one of the other people, and about 50 or 60 feet on the other side of him, a female grizzly bear popped up out of a draw with a cub, which is just the worst situation. You don't want to surprise a grizzly under any circumstances, and certainly not one with a cub. And the bear charged. As they stood up, the bear came right at them. And 50 or 60 feet, a bear can cover that in seconds. And my good friend Ian Stenhouse, who's originally from Glasgow, he was kind of the point of the spear. The bear was coming right at him. And both Ian and Laura said that they could see the moment when the bear changed its mind from I'm going to maul him to I'm not going to maul him. And she got within a few feet of Ian and turned and ran down the hill. to where I was in the thicket. And I knew none of this. I mean, in a matter of seconds, suddenly I heard my friends hollering, "Hey bear, hey bear, hey bear," which is the universal alarm call there for a grizzly bear. And I assumed the bear was down in the thicket where I was, so I froze. And I could hear this loud sound like somebody was banging a couple of 2x4 pieces of lumber together, and that was the bear popping its jaws, clashing its teeth together. And then suddenly there was this crashing going through the brush just 8 or 10 feet from me, and my friends were yelling for me to, just, "Scott, get the hell out of there." And I realized the bear was coming as I was exiting, and we passed each other within 8 or 10 feet. I did not see her, but I smelled her and I heard her. And she and her year-old cub went right through the middle of our mist net setup, managed to miss all the nets, came exploding out the other side, disappeared, running hell for leather. I mean, they were as startled as we were. And the upshot was we caught 3 gray-cheeked thrushes in that net run. I probably chased in by the bear. So the bear wasn't hurt. We weren't hurt. We caught the birds we needed to put geolocator tags on. But that's not an untypical day in Denali. We have had many, many grizzly bear encounters over the years. In fact, we ran into that same female and her cub a year later, not all that far from there. This time we saw them coming well in advance. We managed to get our stuff together and got back to our vehicle, and there were no unfortunate interactions. But you just never know, kind of moment to moment, how things are going to change up there. It's an exciting place to work.
Yeah, sounds. I think I've been very frightened. I mean, I remember the first time I went looking for bear in Finland near the Russian border, and I was walking through the forest with my guide, and he said to me, "We're going to walk to the hide. If you're going to go to the toilet, go to the toilet outside the forest, because you're not going to go to the toilet for the next 18 hours. And I was walking behind him, and I was petrified. I was thinking, I could be picked off. I'm bear meat. I could be picked off now, And it is quite frightening. And I think if I was in that situation, and I wonder what a bear smells like. You say it's pungent. I mean, what does it smell like?
Very sort of a wet dog smell when you smell them that close. It's a very pungent smell. But let me just say that during the 100+ years that Denali National Park has been a national park, there's been one human fatality from a bear. The bears are pretty good at being bears. The people are pretty good at staying out of their way. The bears are, for the most part, pretty tolerant of people. People in unlike many national parks in the United States, where people can just drive their cars in and be stupid wherever they want to, in Denali, access is restricted to Park Service buses, and so the people who do backcountry hiking there are usually a little bit more sophisticated and a little bit more woods wise. But you never know. I mean, it's always it's always a bit of a crapshoot. It keeps you on your toes, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. Well, let's get back onto the subject in hand, the matter in hand. But before we start talking about the bird migration itself, I'm really curious about how you actually wrote this book. I'm always fascinated by writers, because you never expect, or you never kind of think sometimes about naturalists being writers. You always think of maybe the other way around sometimes. And maybe I'm not making myself clear, but basically, you're passionate about migration, and you read this book, and it's written by a writer, not by someone who's just, regaling all the stuff that's happened in the past. It's actually woven together really beautifully. So how long did it take you to write this? Was this an easy process for you?
Well, I've written more than 24 books over the years, and so in some respects, I find writing very easy. In some respects, I find writing very hard. A book like this, I was probably working on this book for a total of about 6 years. It was a lot of travel involved. I traveled to Asia, to the Mediterranean, to South America, the Arctic, Africa. Actually, some of the African stuff didn't even make it into the finished book. So it's just enormously time consuming, and there are always sections of a book that are easier to write than others. I mean, the narrative stuff where you're telling a story, what has happened to you already has provided kind of the narrative framework. You just have to make it make it interesting and make it hold together. You know, a big part of this book is synthesizing a lot of the latest science on migration and bird physiology and navigation and orientation, which means reading a lot of scientific journal articles, which is not my favorite thing to do. It's, you know, as dry as dust and twice as boring sometimes. But, you know, the science that they're writing about is exciting stuff. And then, you know, putting that into a form that other lay people, because I'm a lay person myself, I don't have an academic degree in science. You know, I'm just a really, really interested layperson, and putting it into a form that other lay people can enjoy and be accessible, I find to be a really interesting challenge. I will say the last part of the book, which was not the final chapter, but the last chapter that I was actually writing was I was working in, let's see, the summer of 2019, 2019, excuse me, the summer of 2019. I lose track. The pandemic has caused me to lose track of time. And I had just gotten back actually from our field site in Alaska, where I'd become very ill. And I ended up spending a week in the neurology wing of Massachusetts General Hospital, where the doctors told me they thought I had central nervous system lymphoma or some equally dire terminal disease that was going to kill me very quickly. And I thought, ooh, well, then I better get this book done. So I actually wrote the final chapter while I was in the hospital, thinking I was dying. And then, I'm not making this up, the doctors came in and said, sorry, no, it was just a drug interaction for a drug that we were giving you to treat Lyme disease, which you don't actually have. You're perfectly healthy, go home. So, you know, on the one hand, really, really good news. On the other hand, maybe you could have told me that before I spent a week in the hospital and had PET scans and CT scans and 3 spinal taps, and I mean, every test and lab work that was known to mankind. So, frankly, working on the book gave me something to keep my mind off it. But I don't want to do that again. I don't want to finish a book deadline in the hospital thinking that I'm under a death sentence.
Yeah, but you may have not written as good a one as you did, you know, having that thought in your head. There's been a couple of suggestions regarding the bird on my shoulder. Sean Moore has said, has asked, is it an Eleanor's Falcon? But to be honest, I have to give a massive hand of applause to Mabley. Is it Mabley Element? Because it is an Amor Falcon, and you can tell by the white under wing. But anyway,
it's Ingrid, but
I've
got, yeah, sorry, I must be on my daughter's Zoom by accident.
Okay.
Thanks, David.
You did really well.
Thank you. I'll tell you how I guessed that later if you like.
Yeah, tell me later, definitely. I'd like to know. I'll come back to you. Okay, so Scott, why don't we hear about migration from your point of view?
Well, we can do a couple of things. I can just talk if you'd like, but I also have some images from my travels, some things we can talk about if you don't mind my screen sharing. And
I'd love to. We'd love to see some of your stuff. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to do the awkward screen sharing 2-step here.
Yeah. Whilst you're doing that, I could do a segue. And basically, I've got a friend in Los Angeles who's not a birder, and she sent me a message on Instagram saying, "Oh, I've heard about this guy, Scott. He's doing lots of stuff about migration. Do you know him?" So it's amazing. Your name's getting out there.
Well, you know, migratory birds are interesting, and I think also birds and birding are having a moment right now, at least here in the States. I suspect it's the same thing in the UK. With the pandemic lockdown, so many people were stuck at home and were kind of desperate for anything to take their mind off all the awful stuff that was going on. And for the first time, a lot of people noticed birds in their backyards and their gardens. And I've been inundated with messages from people over the last year asking me, are there more birds because of the pandemic? And it's like, no, probably not. You're just noticing them more. You're hearing them more. There's not as much noise. My wife is a regional director for Massachusetts Audubon, and her sanctuaries have been just awash in people who've never gone outdoors before, who've never been interested in nature or looking at birds before. And it's a real opportunity for us, those of us who are interested in bird conservation, kind of grab this opportunity by the lapels and get as many of these people who are newly interested in birds connected with birds on a more lifetime basis. So yeah, I think this has turned out to be an unexpectedly good time to be talking about bird migration. So let me just start by saying that I have been interested in birds and bird migration my entire life. I grew up in the mountains of eastern Pennsylvania, very close to a place called Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, which was the world's first sanctuary for birds of prey. It was founded in 1934. It's along a ridge in the Appalachian Ridge and Valley system, and along this ridge every fall, the Kittatinny Ridge, about 20,000 migrant hawks, eagles, falcons, vultures pass every year. And when I was a 12-year-old, my parents took me there for the first time on just a perfect migration day when the sky was full of migrating raptors. And I got hooked that day. Well, I got hooked on birds of prey because birds of prey are cool. I got fascinated by the Appalachian Mountain system, of which it was part, that stretches like 2,000 miles from Alabama to northern Newfoundland. And I got hooked on migration. And migration has really become kind of the defining passion of both my personal and professional life for the last half century or so. This is actually the second time I've written a book about migration. Back in the 1990s, I wrote a book called Living on the Wind, which focused on bird migration, specifically in the Western Hemisphere. I spent about 4 or 5 years traveling from Alaska all the way down to the southern tip of South America and back, following bird migration. And I wrote this book very much as an outsider looking in, because, as I said before, I don't have an academic degree in science. I was a fine art major in college. I wanted to be a wildlife artist. Before that, I wanted to be a professional herpetologist and study snakes. But I've always been a birder. And in the 1980s, I'd gotten more and more involved in bird banding, especially hawk trapping and hawk banding. In fact, I ran my own banding station along the Kittatinny Ridge for many years. When I wrote Living on the Wind in the mid-1990s, it was as somebody with this growing professional interest in migration, but really just kind of dabbling around the edges, doing bird banding and some other stuff. But in the last 20 or 25 years, I've gotten more and more directly involved in migration research. I've gotten very involved in studying the migration of northern saw-whet owls, of the winter ecology of migrating snowy owls, working, as I said before, in Alaska, studying the migration of half a dozen different species of birds that migrate out of Alaska, working to build build out the MODIS wildlife tracking system that's allowing us to track even the tiniest migrants, even tiny migrating insects across landscape bases. And also in the last 20 or 25 years, we've learned so much more about migration, about the science of migration and the physiology of migration. So A World on the Wing was an opportunity to kind of go back. And by the way, you showed the cover of the book from the UK edition. This is the cover of the book on the US edition. So if you're scratching your head and wondering why it doesn't look the same, that's the reason.
I think the US version looks better.
It's different. I really like the artwork on the UK edition. I think it's pretty snazzy looking. My wife likes that one better, to be honest with you. But this is it seems like a pretty bleak time to be writing about migration. All of us who are birders have known for a long time there are not as many birds as there used to be. And 2 years ago here in North America, a team of the top ornithologists in North America, in the US and Canada and elsewhere, published a paper in Journal Science showing that about a third of North America's birds, about 3 billion birds, have disappeared since I started bird watching in the late 1960s and early 1970s. But while the situation can seem really bleak, we have to remember that around the world, conservationists are confronting the challenges that migratory birds are facing, and against a lot of really steep odds, they're making progress, often in some of the most unexpected places. For example, one of the places that my research for this new book took me was to one of the world's most important migratory choke points, and arguably the most endangered, which is the Yellow Sea between China and the Korean Peninsula. Somewhere between 11 and 13 million migratory shorebirds, migratory waders, depend on the Yellow Sea every year, coming from as far south as New Zealand and Australia and Oceania, and heading as far north as Eastern Eurasia, the Russian Far East, and Alaska. But it's also one of the most endangered migration choke points in the world, because the mudflats of the Yellow Sea, which are the largest in the world, when the tide goes out at a place like this at Dongling, north of Shanghai, the tide goes out for like 20 or 30 kilometers. I mean, you don't even get a hint of the ocean when the tide goes out there. And these enormous mudflats are a buffet for these birds that have, in many cases, flown 6,000 miles nonstop. It's an invertebrate buffet for them. But China and South Korea in particular have destroyed about 60 or 70% of the mudflats on the Yellow Sea. They've walled it off with seawalls and filled it in with sediment and turned it into dry land for industrial sites and cities, or deep aquaculture ponds like these for shrimp and jellyfish, which really don't do the shorebirds any good because they're much too deep for them. So we're at the point now where folks like Dr. Tunis Piersma from the Netherlands, who's been studying the birds on the Yellow Sea for decades, told me we are at a birds per hectare equation, basically. For every additional hectare of mudflats in the Yellow Sea that's lost, we lose birds because they simply have no place else to go. You know, when South Korea a couple of years ago walled off 150 square miles of tidal estuary with a 21-mile seawall, a fifth of the world's great knots depended on those tidal flats. And after they built that seawall, a fifth of the world's great knots disappeared. Those birds just had no place else to go. And the bird that's become the poster child for what's going on in the Yellow Sea is one of the most endangered birds in the world. This, of course, is the spoon-billed sandpiper. Most birders are familiar with the spoonies, even though most average people are not. The world's most endangered shorebird, only between 200 and 600, depending on whose numbers you listen to. One of the most endangered birds in the world, frankly. They breed in the Russian Far East in a very narrow strip of land along the coast. They winter in Southeast Asia, in Myanmar and Vietnam and Thailand and elsewhere down there, in some parts of southern China. And the Yellow Sea is utterly and completely critical for them. They stop on both their northbound and southbound migration. They stop there during their molt. Without the Yellow Sea, these birds cease to exist. And so they've become the poster child for Yellow Sea conservation, for conservationists like Jing Li, who founded the small nonprofit Spoon-billed Sandpiper in China, and a lot of other international conservationists like my friend Tunis Piersma. And here's the thing, the pressure that they have been putting on the Chinese government has paid off. When I went over to the Yellow Sea in the spring of 2018, I figured it was going to be to write the most depressing chapter of the book because of this imminent collapse of the Yellow Sea ecosystem. And in fact, Tunis told me he thought that his role over the last 10 or 15 years has been to document the extinction of the birds using the Yellow Sea. Well, just a few months before I got over there, the Chinese government did what totalitarian governments can sometimes do. They issued a sweeping ban on all further commercial destruction of Yellow Sea mudflats on the Chinese side of the Yellow Sea. They nominated about a dozen and a half sites for UNESCO World Heritage Protection. They have since nominated, those sites were approved by UNESCO. They've nominated another dozen or so of the most important shorebird sites. And so Jing and Tunis and some of the other conservationists who've been battling for years to try to protect the Yellow Sea are finding themselves, as I said in the book, grappling with this unfamiliar emotion of hope. But of course, there's a lot of other pressures on migratory birds. One of the reasons spoon-billed sandpipers continue to decline, even with this additional protection for the Yellow Sea, is that they're being illegally hunted in many parts of Asia. Illegal bird killing is rampant in much of Asia. And it's not a problem only in Asia. I mean, this is something, as I'm sure many of the folks on this call today know, is a significant problem in the Mediterranean basin. So birds using flyways like this female Eurasian blackcap coming out of Europe and Eurasia and down into the Middle East and Africa really have to run a tremendous gauntlet through places like Egypt, which kills about 5.4 million birds, mostly songbirds, every year. Lebanon and Syria, 4 million birds in Syria, 2.5 million in Lebanon. Well, okay, you think those are fairly war-torn, troubled parts of the world, but every year, 500,000 birds, ortolan buntings, several species of thrushes, are killed illegally in France for food. And of course, the worst place in the entire Mediterranean basin in terms of raw numbers is Italy, where more than 5.5 million birds, especially songbirds, are killed every year. And this is not subsistence hunting. This is, for the most part, these are luxury items. These are birds that are being eaten out of a sense of tradition and generally in flagrant disregard for the law. In all, about 11 to 36 million birds a year killed every year in the Mediterranean. The black hole of the Mediterranean, though, in terms of the greatest number of birds killed per square mile of land or per capita population, is the island of Cyprus. About 2.5 to 3 million birds a year. In recent years, it's been as high as 10 million birds. And the lure here is a traditional dish called umbilipulia, which is just sautéed whole songbirds, generally blackcaps, usually caught in the fall when they're plumpest, plucked, sautéed whole in a little bit of oil and a little bit of salt, and you pick the bird up by the head and you bite through the neck and you chomp the whole rest of it down. And again, this is not a subsistence food. This will set you back 60 to 80 euros. So a significant amount of money for a plate of 12 of these little tiny birds. Traditionally, in Cyprus and across the Mediterranean, birds were caught using lime sticks, using gummy substances to catch them. For the most part now, the trapping is industrial scale using mist nets and audio lures. And for many years, the worst of the netting occurred on 2 British military bases in southern Cyprus, where it was kind of a no holds barred, turn a blind eye kind of approach by the law enforcement authorities. But thanks to a lot of pressure in the UK and from international groups, British military has cracked down significantly on poaching on these bases. The officers are using, in this case, these guys are flying high-tech drones fitted with infrared. And by the way, I've pixelated their faces here for their safety. These Cypriot officers live in the villages that they're protecting, and the organized crime that runs most of the poaching rings there has launched grenade attacks on their barracks in retaliation for the crackdown. But it's been very effective. They've reduced the poaching on the bases dramatically, although kind of like squeezing a balloon, the pressure pops out elsewhere in the Republic of Cyprus and in the Turkish-controlled north of Cyprus. I also had a chance to visit one of the most remote places I've ever been in a lifetime of traveling to remote places, and this is the mountainous and politically unsettled state of Nagaland in northeastern India. This is the little thumb of India that sticks up between Myanmar and China. And the reason there, the attraction there, as you may have guessed from the picture that David had, are Amor falcons. Every year, millions of Amor falcons migrating from their breeding grounds in Siberia and China to their wintering grounds in southern Africa pass through Nagaland. They stage up there in late October and early November. These are largely insectivorous falcons, and so they're feeding on trillions and trillions of subterranean termites that emerge in the wake of the seasonal monsoon rains and rise into the sky on their mating flights. They're the perfect food for a falcon that is going to have, it has probably the longest migration of any raptor on Earth, about 18,000 miles a year, and by far the longest overwater migration of any raptor, 2,400 miles across the Indian Ocean from the west coast of India to the Horn of Africa. So they need to tank up on these termites before they make that flight. We didn't know anything, we in the outside world didn't know anything about the Amor falcon migration through Nagaland until the fall of 2012, when a woman named Bano Haralu, who's a local conservationist and former television news reporter, and some of her colleagues discovered that not only were the falcons gathering in tremendous numbers in a remote part of Nagaland, but that the local villagers were killing them by the hundreds of thousands. Now, again, this is not a subsistence hunt, and it's not a traditional hunt. The birds didn't start gathering in really dense numbers until the Indian government built a hydroelectric dam around 2000 or so. And for whatever reason, the birds began forming these incredibly dense nocturnal roosts where there'd be, 100,000 falcons packed into a couple hectares of forest. And the local communities realized, hey, we can string our fishing nets up here and catch lots of falcons and pluck them and smoke them and take them to the larger towns and cities and sell them for cash money. And that's exactly what was happening. 140,000 falcons killed in a 10-day period during the peak of the fall migration. Well, it was an extraordinarily upsetting story for people. And usually when something like that happens and the outside world finds out about it, there's this long process of back and forth and negotiations and threatening legal action and just this long process to try to correct the problem. And that didn't happen in Nagaland. In fact, one of the most remarkable things in my experience in migratory conservation happened when, well, first of all, this falcon kill was technically illegal, and the authorities have been turning a blind eye to it for a long time. So with increased law enforcement, people were told, look, we're not going to let you get away with this anymore. There was also a massive conservation education effort by Conservation India and BirdLife International and the Nagaland Wildlife Conservation Trust, which is Bano Haralu's small organization. And that was coupled with a genuine realization, genuine recognition on the part of these Naga communities that their actions were threatening the falcons. They didn't realize that. And so they said, okay, we'll stop. And they did completely from one year to the next. 140,000 dead falcons one year, almost none the next year. Well, one of the reasons that they stopped so quickly was they were also told that people will want to come and see this. Tourists are going to want to come to see this. Tourists are going to want to pay to see this. And when I heard about this, I thought, I need to see this for myself. I've been a raptor nut all my life. And my good friend Kevin Laughlin, who runs a tour company in the US called Wildside Nature Tours, he and I decided, let's see how possible it is to take tour groups in there so that we can provide some on-the-ground support for this burgeoning wildlife conservation effort. So we spent 2 years planning, and in the fall of 2017, we were among the first Westerners to visit Nagaland and see these newly protected falcons for ourselves. And I have to tell you that in a lifetime of chasing bird spectacles around the planet, this was probably the single most awe-inspiring bird spectacle I've ever witnessed. To see hundreds of thousands of Amor falcons rising up out of these nighttime roosts for hour after hour in the morning, starting before daybreak when it's so dark that you don't see them, but you can hear this rushing of wings overhead that sounds like rushing water. And just wave after wave after wave, as I say, for hours. Every time another explosion of birds would come up, you think, okay, well, that's it. And you'd put your binoculars, your spotting scope in the trees, and they'd still be draped under all of these falcons. It was an extraordinary thing to see, and an extraordinarily impressive bit of good news at a time when that can be kind of hard to find in migration. But there's actually a lot of good that's happening for migratory birds and migratory bird conservation. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we've got tools today that we didn't have even just 10 years ago, that show us where these birds are, in what numbers, and give us avenues for safeguarding them and protecting them and beginning to restore their populations. A big part of this now is big data, the fact that we have these enormous data sets and the computing power to finally start to crunch and analyze them. So for example, here in North America, we have a network of 143 Doppler weather radar stations across the lower 48 states, which the National Weather Service did not build in the 1980s to help ornithologists, but it's one of the biggest developments for ornithology in the last century, because the Doppler radar allows us to not just see big blobs of birds moving en masse, but with especially the newer kinds of Doppler radar, actually calculate precisely how many birds per cubic kilometer of airspace are up there. Now, we can't tell what kind they are, but that's where other kinds of big data like eBird come in. So that's where we're able to paint in the details of where birds are moving on a day-to-day, almost hour-to-hour basis, because we have such a rich data set from millions of birders across North America and increasingly across the world. And you start combining these areas of big data, and you can make an on-the-ground difference for bird conservation. For example, scientists with the Nature Conservancy in California desperately wanted to create better bird habitat in the agricultural Central Valley of California, which is a major stopover point along the Pacific Flyway, especially for migratory shorebirds like these black-necked stilts. The problem is the land is really expensive because it's extremely valuable farmland. And so they can't really afford to buy very much land. But they realized what they could do is take eBird data that told them exactly what species of birds are coming through at exactly what time of the year, combine that with radar data that shows you in real time where the birds are, and also high resolution satellite imagery from NASA that shows surface water conditions in the Central Valley. Combine all that together, and you can pay farmers relatively small amounts of money to flood some of their fields at just the right time, at just the right depth of water for just long enough to create what they call pop-up wetlands, tens of thousands of acres of really good habitat just when the birds need it, and do it for a fraction of the amount of money that it would cost to buy that land and put it permanently into conservation. If it's a wet year and there's lots of water, you don't even, certain natural surface water, you don't have to even pay the farmers anything at all. So, I mean, these kinds of new approaches to using big data are paying off in big ways on the ground for birds. We're also using increasingly tiny, highly miniaturized tracking technology. This is the part of migration research that I've been most directly involved in, and it's just incredibly exciting. Until recently, if you wanted to track a migratory bird across any distance, if you were tracking anything smaller than about the size of a duck, you were out of luck, because the transmitters were just too heavy to put on birds the size of this Kirtland's warbler, for example. The transmitter weighed more than the bird did. But now there are highly miniaturized VHF, what are called Nano Tag Transmitters, that are small enough to put on hummingbirds, on the smallest birds in the world. They're actually small enough to put on migratory insects like monarch butterflies. And we can track them with something called the Modus Wildlife Tracking System, which is just basically a network of now, at this point, something like 1,300 automated receiver stations like this one, scattered mostly in North America, mostly in the Western Hemisphere, but increasingly in Europe, increasingly in Australia and parts of Asia, and track these birds or bats or butterflies or whatever across landscape distances, giving us an opportunity to track animals we've never been able to track before. If you're dealing with a somewhat larger species, like the snowy owls that I've been working with for the last 7 or 8 years through Project Snowstorm, well, I mean, gosh, you've got a matchbox-sized transmitter that weighs about 2 ounces, which is nothing on a bird that weighs, 2,600 grams. And they're solar powered. They continuously communicate with the GPS system overhead, so they're constantly logging highly accurate GPS locations. And then a couple of times a week, they dial up through the cell phone network and they send us the information. I like to joke that my friends are cooler than your friends because I get text messages from snowy owls. And we've got little accelerometers in there. We've got temperature sensors in there. So we're getting this fire hose of data from where these birds are going. So, we're discovering not just what routes these birds are taking, but the sheer physical abilities of migratory birds, which keep eclipsing whatever we thought we knew about them. I mean, when I wrote Living on the Wind 25 years ago, we thought Arctic terns migrated 25,000 miles a year, but we had no way of actually tracking them. Now that we can put geolocators on them and track their movements, it turns out some of them are traveling 57,000 miles a year. Arctic terns that breed on the coast of Maine are spending the winter in the Indian Ocean. And even the tiniest migrants do incredible things. A female ruby-throated hummingbird that weighs 3 grams flies 600 miles nonstop twice a year across the Gulf of Mexico, a journey that's going to take it about 24 hours, beating its wings 60 times a second that entire time. When it comes to migration endurance, even tiny birds like this little semi-palmated sandpiper from North America, which is 6 inches long and weighs just slightly more than an ounce, they make extraordinary migrations. The population of semi-palmated sandpipers that breeds in the central and eastern Canadian Arctic takes off from the northeastern coast of North America and flies 3,300 miles nonstop across the western Atlantic Ocean all the way to the northeastern coast of South America. If these were human beings running marathons, that would be 126 consecutive marathons without a break for food or water or rest. A couple of years ago, a runner broke the 4-hour record for a marathon, and he was hailed as being superhuman, which is probably true, but he still was subavian. And in fact, anytime that you compare a human athlete to a bird, you're probably insulting the bird. If you think of the most elite human athletes, probably like a male Tour de France cyclist, at the pinnacle of what a human being can achieve, they can only do that for a relatively short period of time, less than a day, and only with regular hydration and regular food. But even so, they're operating at about 4 or 5 times their base metabolism. Well, a bird just right off the shelf is operating at a higher metabolic rate because their body temperature is much higher than a human. Their metabolic rate overall is much higher. And when they're migrating, that little semi-palm sandpiper is actually operating at 8 or 9 times its base metabolism. But they do have one thing in common with human athletes. The semi-palm sandpipers that stop off on the Bay of Fundy in the Canadian Maritimes, where the tide goes out and exposes these enormous mudflats, kind of like the Yellow Sea in China. Well, they preferentially feed on those mudflats on a tiny little crustacean called corophium. And they eat corophium not just because they're nutritious, which they are, but because corophium also contain high levels of omega-3 fatty acids. And those omega-3s, they basically act like a performance enhancing drug. They supercharge the bird's muscles. They dramatically increase the muscle's aerobic capacity. The difference between what the bird is doing and what Lance Armstrong did is what the bird is doing is legal. And all of that's amazing enough. But every time we think we understand what the physical limits are for migratory birds, the birds blow right past them. And sometimes they stretch credulity right to the breaking point. For example, in 2013, scientists in Switzerland were curious about where alpine swifts that breed in Switzerland in the summertime go during the winter. They knew they traveled to Africa, but they weren't sure exactly where they went. They didn't know what routes they took, and they were curious about what's known as the Swift's time budget, how much of the day they spent flying and feeding, and how much of the time they spent resting. So they put little tiny data loggers on these birds that had geolocators in them that would tell them when the birds came back where the birds had been, and also little accelerometers that would measure how much of their day was active and how much of the day was resting. So these birds took off from Switzerland, they flew down to Africa, they spent the winter there, they came back the next year, and when the scientists downloaded the data, they were shocked to find out these birds don't stop flying. Once they leave Europe, once they leave Switzerland, on their migration south, the entire time they're in Africa in the winter and on their way back in the spring, they fly continuously for more than 200 days. At first, they thought the accelerometers had jammed, but this is actually what these birds do. And in fact, 2 years later, scientists in Sweden did the same study with common swifts and discovered common swifts actually don't stop flying for 10 months. 10 months of continual flight in the air, never setting. If these birds didn't have to lay an egg and incubate it, I don't think they would ever land. They would completely sever their ties to the earth. We know that birds can fly in a single leap without any acclimation over the highest peaks of the Himalayas, that they're able to maintain themselves through months and months of constant flight by putting alternating halves of their brain to sleep for a couple of seconds at a time. We've learned that they navigate using a form of quantum physics that was so weird it made Einstein queasy, but may hold the secret to faster than light communication. We have just scratched the surface of what migratory birds can do. I have never felt a moment's regret in the fact that I've devoted so much of my life to watching and studying and just being humbled and awed by bird migration, because what birds do in migration is nothing short of miraculous. So I'm gonna stop screen sharing at this point, and whoops.
Well, what I will say, Scott, that was totally and utterly fascinating. I mean, I was ready to sit for another 2-3 hours listening, because it's just incredible.
I won't make you do that.
I'd love it if you did. I mean, it's just incredible when you think about birds and their migration. The fact that way back when people thought that swallows slept for the winter in the mud under ponds, and then latterly people thought that birds just flew from A to B and then B to A. It's just amazing. I mean, what's been the biggest surprise for you in terms of, like you talked about the Alpine Swift, and the fact that the Arctic tern actually travels far further than people thought? What's been one of the biggest surprises for you?
Well, I have to tell you that the Alpine Swift and Common Swift thing, when I first read that paper, I thought, no, that can't be right. That the accelerometers must have jammed up. I mean, I've worked enough with this high-tech technology. I know that sometimes it just doesn't work. But the scientists who did that correctly, they were able to show that these accelerometers were working just fine, because once the birds came back to the breeding grounds and were actually resting, the accelerometers went back to showing, active rest periods. You know, birds, we don't give birds enough credit. For example, one of my former research technicians, a young guy named Gunnar Kramer, after he worked for me one winter studying saw-whet owls, he went off to get his PhD, and he was studying golden-winged warblers, a beautiful songbird that breeds in the Appalachians and across eastern North America. And Gunnar was putting tiny little geolocators on his male golden-winged warblers to find out where they were going in the winter. And when he downloaded the data from his geolocators, one of the things that he discovered was when these birds had come back to their breeding grounds in the southern Appalachian Mountains. And all of a sudden, during one several-day period, these birds moved either hundreds of miles to the south, some of them as far south as Cuba, or far to the east into Georgia for just a couple of days, and then came back to the breeding grounds. And they thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. He thought there was a hiccup in the geolocator data, but he ran the data a bunch of times. It kept coming up. Then he looked at what had happened during that period of time with the weather, and he realized that the birds had moved out of the area, their breeding area in the southern Appalachians, about 36 hours before a massive line of storms came through that spawned a record-breaking number of tornadoes. And basically what these birds somehow sensed that this massive storm front was coming. They moved out of its way, and as soon as it was passed, they came back again, having moved, in some cases, flown a couple of thousand miles in the course of doing this. I know a lot of ornithologists today who still don't believe that paper. They still think Gunnar and his colleagues screwed something up in their analysis. But I've looked at their data and I thought it's pretty compelling. And it would not surprise me that birds, which can hear extremely low frequency sound waves, which can sense barometric pressure changes, would know, hey, there's something bad coming this way. Let's get out of the way. I'm no longer willing to say where I think the limits are for what birds can do.
Incredible. Now, migration in the past has been kind of measured, or we've tried to measure it by banding or ringing. From what I can see, I mean, I used to work with the British Trust for Ornithology, and I know, for example, they ringed, maybe 100,000 common cuckoos and only ever got, and that was from 1932, whatever, to the late 90s, and only got maybe 8 or 9 recoveries, total. And you've mentioned yourself in your book about the numbers of birds that have been ringed, and you're basically relying on them being found, dead. And in some cases, like with waterfowl, most of the recoveries are from hunters. So we're not seeing them as birders or scientists. Do you think that ringing and banding still has a place? Is it going to be kind of obsolete?
I actually don't think it will. I think it has. I mean, all of these technologies, all of these approaches are complementary. They can allow us to answer different questions in different ways. Maintaining an up-to-date banding or ringing data set, I think, is important, especially in terms of understanding demography. I mean, for example, if all you're interested in is learning migration routes, ringing and banding are not a particularly effective approach because, as you said, the recoveries are very low. But if you're interested, for example, in year-to-year survival, here in North America, we have what's known as the MAPS program, Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship, where banders are working. It's a constant effort mist netting program where they run the same number of nets in the same place for the same number of days, year after year after year after year on the breeding grounds. They're tracking how many adults are returning to those breeding grounds every year, what percentage of the chicks are re-encountered again. And it's giving us the kind of demographic data on population, the constraints on populations, and particularly on mortality and survival that we can't get any other way. So, I've been a bird bander for 35 years. And I suspect 35 years from now, it won't be me, but there'll still be people out there banding and ringing birds, but they'll also be taking feather samples so that we can look at the genetics of birds, the Bird Genoscape project that's encouraging all banders to pull one feather from every bird, because what we can learn from the DNA in the epithelial cells of those birds can tell us about population structure and genetic diversity and connectivity. We can look at the isotopes, the chemical isotopes in those feathers, and tell you know, where those feathers were grown, geographically, what geographic population of birds coming from, how their diet has changed over time. You know, it's so exciting right now because there are so many new techniques and new technologies that are allowing us to ask questions that we couldn't ask even just a couple of years ago.
It's fascinating. Do birds actually do the same trip every year individually, or sometimes you find that some birds are actually some individuals stay. I know I've been hearing about white storks in Europe, for example, Spain. Some of them have been ringed or at least satellite tagged, actually not ringed, and they found that they travel to and from Morocco, for example, and Spain, sometimes several times in the same season. But then the next year, the same bird decides to stay in Spain, and then the following year it might fly to Africa. And similarly, they did the same thing with Egyptian vulture, and they found that particular bird that they tagged, it went to Africa and back maybe 4 or 5 times that year. So there doesn't seem to be any kind of rhyme nor reason.
Well, it depends on the bird. And by the way, I hate it when the birds don't read the rule book. That's really frustrating. One of the species I've been working with are snowy owls, and we have one of our male snowy owls that we've been following now for about 4 years. And every year, right as clockwork, regular as clockwork, he comes down to the North Shore of Lake Ontario or the St. Lawrence River Valley in southern Quebec or Ontario. Except this year, when the little bugger stayed way north up in the Ungava Peninsula, up in the subarctic of Quebec. Why? We don't know. He may have just found a good place up there with a lot of food. That was an area where there was a high lemming population last summer. But yeah, sometimes these birds do things that we don't think they're supposed to do. And usually we don't think they're supposed to do that is more a reflection of our ignorance of the wide variety of strategies that many birds will undertake. But we also know that some birds show incredible fidelity to not just their breeding grounds in the northern hemisphere, for example, but their wintering grounds in the neotropics or the old world tropics. Now, the routes they take back and forth between there can often shift, and that has a lot to do with prevailing weather patterns. If the bird's coming, if we've got a bird that's coming north across the Gulf of Mexico and on its way up to central Canada, if it hits North America and there's just day after day after day of really strong west winds, it may end up flying considerably farther to the east than it normally would. And in fact, using eBird data, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has been able to show that from year to year, the majority of passerine migration in North America can shift dramatically. Some years, most of the passerine migration is going to be east of the Alleghenies and Appalachian Mountains and up along the eastern coastal plain, where in other years, because of prevailing winds, the majority of those birds are going to be going up kind of the central Mississippi Valley flyway and up through the Midwest. So there's a lot of year-to-year variation, but those birds are still going to probably end up back on the same territories where they were the previous breeding season.
And what about climate change? How is that affecting migration? I've been hearing anecdotal evidence that, for example, the Sahara is increasing in size, and the birds are not they can't adapt quick enough to do that longer journey. Yeah. Is it a really massive threat to migratory birds?
Well, we expect that climate change is going to be, the big enchilada for most migratory birds. It's interesting with the Sahara because your Palearctic migrants have those that are trans-Saharan migrants really have a tough trip because you've got first a desert and then a sea to cross on their way back to Europe, and that puts them under, I think, much greater stress than a lot of the birds in the neotropical Nearctic system. But some of the climate models I've seen suggest that the Sahara is going to get drier and bigger. Other climate models suggest it will change the pattern of monsoon rains and we'll have a wetter Sahara as we've had at times in the past. Our climate models are constantly getting better, but there's still an awful lot of uncertainty. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology has done some climate modeling looking at how climate change is going to affect the weather patterns on which bird migration in North America is already dependent. And they found there's going to be winners and losers depending on the species of bird and the time of the year. For example, at some times of the year, they expect that contrary winds, especially crosswinds or headwinds, are going to become much stronger, which is going to be much harder on birds. But at other times of the year and in other parts of North America, prevailing tailwinds, which are going to be helpful to the birds, may actually increase. But the thing about it is, you think about bird migration, how it's dependent on this delicate balance between time and distance and weather and wind and resources and the physiological ability of birds. And if you start changing any of those variables in significant ways, the migrations that are at the greatest and most immediate risk are the most dramatic and the most epic, because they're the ones where the birds are already right on a knife edge. Bar-tailed godwits flying 11 days nonstop from Alaska to New Zealand, 11,000 kilometers across the widest part of the Pacific Ocean. That's a bird that does not have a lot of margin for error. And on top of that, you think about what we've done to so much of the habitat on which these birds depend. Even if they can deal with the rapidity of climate change, and yeah, I mean, I get climate skeptics all the time saying, "Oh yeah, Chicken Little's claiming that the sky is falling. The climate's changed much more dramatically in the past," which is true, but it's done so at a much, much slower scale. The time scale at which these changes are happening right now are just more than I suspect some birds are going to be able to handle. But we're actually seeing the climate affecting the physical size and shape of birds. My friend Tunis Piersma in the Netherlands, who's done so much work on shorebirds, has shown that red knots breeding in the Siberian Arctic are getting smaller, and particularly red knots that are born in especially warm years in the Siberian Arctic are significantly smaller than those born in cooler years, probably because the resources aren't there. They're kind of like stunted kids who have poor nutrition when they're growing up. That's a problem for these birds, because when they get to the wintering grounds in Africa, their bills aren't long enough to probe deeply enough into shoreline settlement for the small mollusks that they need. So they're forced to feed on seagrass rhizomes near the surface that are not nearly as nutritious. Here in North America, scientists a couple of years ago at the Field Museum in Chicago meticulously measured something like 70,000 bird skins from migratory species that have over the years have crashed into buildings in Chicago. And what they found that over the last 40 years, across hundreds of different species, all of them have gotten significantly smaller with time. As the climate has gotten warmer, the size of these birds is decreasing, except for their wing length. Wing length is actually getting a little bit longer. And their hypothesis here is that as these birds are shrinking because of warming climate, because they need to be more efficient in a warmer and warmer environment, they need to get as much energy or as much flight lift out of every calorie of energy they burn, and longer and more tapered wings are the ways to do it. Think about long distance migrants, falcons and shorebirds and swallows and swifts. They all have longer pointy wings. And so all of these birds are slowly developing longer and more pointy wings. Is that encouraging? Yeah, that may be a sign of evolutionary change, that these birds are shifting in response to the environment. Can they shift fast enough and far enough? That we're going to find out.
Wow. Scott, what's your favorite bird?
This morning it was a banded hermit thrush, a bird that I had ringed here last year, probably, that just came back. Our hermit thrush has just arrived here in New Hampshire in the last week or so, and it was hopping around out in the backyard around the edge of the wildflower garden. I haven't set my nets up yet. I haven't caught it. I don't have a geolocator on it. I won't be able to tell where it was. I'm just very happy it's back, because hermit thrushes sing most beautifully in the evening. They're kind of our version of a nightingale. And my wife and I love sitting out on the deck in the evening, slapping New Hampshire mosquitoes and listening to the songs of hermit thrushes. So today it's a hermit thrush.
Okay, that's fantastic. Zoomers, just to let you know that coming up on Thursday, we've got Sarah Gibson. She's a writer, a conservationist, and she's written a book on swifts called Swifts and Us. So we'll be talking about swifts. On Monday, the 10th of May, no, let me start again. On May the 7th, whenever that day is, Monday, Oh, it's the 10th of May, sorry. On Monday the 10th of May, sorry, at 7 o'clock, we got Catherine Norbury, who has compiled a book called Women in Nature, and it's all about what women have talked about in terms of nature since centuries ago till now. So that's going to be quite an interesting evening. On Thursday, the 27th of May, we've got James Lowen, and he's talking about moths. Much Ado About Mothing is the name of his talk. On Monday, the 31st of May, we got a guy called Les Stroud, who, do you know him?
I know of him. I've never met him, but
Yeah,
Canadian survival expert.
that's right. I don't know him at all, but it's really interesting what he's doing, and we're going to be talking about surviving in nature. So we'll take on your story about the bear, and he'll give us some expert advice. On Monday, the 7th of June, we've got Charlie Corbett, who's written a book called 12 Birds to Save Your Life. So that'd be worth checking out. And on Monday, the 28th of June, we've got Joe Shute, a journalist, and he's written about the weather. What do we know about the weather? So that could be will be an interesting evening. And we've got a couple more people turning up as well between now and the end of June. And the season ends, by the way, at the end of June. So we've got some really good stuff coming up. But we've had a superb night tonight. Scott, I mean, I don't know where to start in terms of thanking you, but it's just fascinating, and I'll be engrossed in this book once I finish my deadlines. Absolutely. Thank you for coming, Scott. I hope you've enjoyed it tonight.
It's been a real pleasure, and the only thing I'll take in as a thank you from you is get in touch with me the next time you're in the States so we can do some birding together.
Well, absolutely. I'm planning to do that next year, hopefully, all being well. And Zoomers, what can I say? Again, really appreciate you taking your time out to be here. We've been doing it over a year now, and you're still coming to listen to and get involved in these talks. So thank you very much, and I hope you all take care of yourselves, and don't forget to keep looking up.